A light drizzle kissed the worn sidewalks of New York City as the bustling crowd pushed through the damp air, their hurried footsteps echoing off the towering skyscrapers. Amidst the sea of hurried humanity, a frail figure sat slumped against the chipped bricks of an old building, his tattered coat clinging to his shivering frame. His once proud face, framed by a graying beard, now bore the harsh lines of a life that had taken a cruel turn. John McMillan, a man in his late 50s, once owned a thriving auto parts business in Pennsylvania. His calloused hands, now clutching a weathered cardboard sign that read, "Hungry, homeless, forgotten," had once signed paychecks for a dozen employees. But today they trembled not from cold, but from the weight of memories and regrets. As the drizzle intensified, people rushed past him, their umbrellas blooming like flowers in the rain. John's hollow eyes scanned the passing faces, hoping for a kind glance, a warm dollar bill, or perhaps just a nod of acknowledgement. But he had become invisible, a ghost among the living, reduced to a statistic, a casualty of economic shifts he had no power to control. Then, as if the storm had sensed the gravity of the moment, the rain slowed and the hum of the city softened. A black SUV, sleek and armored, pulled up to the curb. Its polished frame reflected the flashing lights of a nearby street vendor's cart. The rear door swung open and out stepped a tall figure, his distinct golden hair catching the waning daylight. It was Donald Trump, the sitting president of the United States, flanked by his Secret Service agents. John's eyes widened as he recognized the man. A surge of emotion, sharp and bitter, twisted his heart. He couldn't contain himself. His voice, hoarse from the chill and long silences, burst forth. "Hey! Hey, you! Trump!" John croaked, struggling to rise from his cardboard seat. He gripped the edge of the building for support, his legs weak and unsteady. The president, mid-conversation with an aide, paused and turned his sharp blue eyes toward the sound. His gaze locked onto the disheveled figure before him. The agents stiffened, their hands moving instinctively closer to their concealed firearms. "Mr. President, it's just a homeless man. We should move along," one of the agents whispered, trying to steer Trump back toward the SUV. But Trump, curious as ever and never one to shy away from a confrontation, raised his hand, signaling them to stand down. "What is it?" Trump's voice cut through the noise of the street, both commanding and curious. John took a deep breath, his chest heaving as if pulling up the remnants of his former pride from the depths of his weary soul. He pointed a shaky finger at Trump, his voice growing louder, stronger with each word. You did this to me," John spat, his face twisting into a mask of both rage and sorrow. "Your policies, your tax cuts for the rich, your trade wars, they ruined me. I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always a beggar." Trump's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. The nearby crowd began to slow, some stopping to watch the unfolding scene, their phones already recording. The drizzle continued, the tiny droplets catching the streetlights like shards of broken glass, framing the moment with a raw, cinematic intensity. Trump took a step closer, his expensive leather shoes splashing against the wet pavement. He leaned in, close enough to smell the stale alcohol and unwashed fabric clinging to John's battered frame. "Tell me, old man," Trump replied, his voice low but clear, dripping with both challenge and curiosity, "what makes you think I did this to you?" John's hand fell back to his side, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his story threatened to crush him. But he straightened, forcing his spine to remember the days when he was a man who commanded respect, a man with a purpose. "Sit tight, Mr. President," John said, his voice trembling but defiant. "You're about to hear the truth they don't tell you in those fancy meetings." The street around them seemed to hold its breath, the muted whispers of the curious onlookers blending with the soft patter of the rain. Trump, his iconic suit sharp against the gritty backdrop, crossed his arms, a hint of skepticism playing at the corners of his mouth. He had been confronted by critics before, journalists, politicians, even celebrities, but never a street beggar. John steadied himself, his legs still shaky, but his mind suddenly sharp, the fire of his former self rekindling. "I wasn't always like this," John began, his voice rising over the rustle of passing umbrellas and the distant honks of impatient taxis. "Just a few years ago, I owned a small auto parts business in Scranton. It wasn't a billion-dollar empire, but it put food on the table, sent my daughter to college, and gave my wife the life she deserved." Trump's eyes narrowed, his head tilting slightly as he studied the man before him. John's words cut through the usual street noise, a stark reminder of the countless small businesses that formed the backbone of the American economy. "I poured my soul into that business," John continued, his voice growing stronger, working 16-hour days, managing everything from payroll to late-night repairs. "My hands built the place, my sweat, my blood. But then you came along with your promises of tax cuts and economic reforms. Trump's jaw tightened, his stance shifting slightly. He had heard this line before, critics blaming him for the very policies he believed had sparked the greatest economic boom in decades. "Don't blame me for your bad business decisions," Trump shot back, his voice cutting through the damp air like a blade. "I cut taxes to help people like you, to bring jobs back to this country. Maybe you just didn't adapt." John's eyes flashed, a spark of defiance in their tired depths. "Adapt? You think I didn't try? Your tariffs on imported steel and auto parts squeezed my margins until there was nothing left. The suppliers I relied on either went under or jacked up their prices. My customers, local garages, small-time mechanics, they couldn't afford the higher costs, and I couldn't pass them on without losing my loyal base." Trump remained silent, his gaze locked on John as the crowd around them thickened, the curious whispers growing louder. "Then came your corporate tax cuts," John continued, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. "Big corporations, the giants, they got to keep more of their profits, which they used to automate, to buy out smaller competitors, to undercut guys like me. The banks stopped lending to small businesses like mine, the same banks your policies helped get richer." Trump opened his mouth to respond, but John cut him off, his voice rising to a shout. "I was a proud American business owner, and now I'm nothing but a ghost, begging for scraps in a city that used to be my marketplace. You talk about making America great again, but what about the little guys you left behind? What about the lives shattered by your so-called progress?" For a moment, the street fell silent, the distant wail of a siren the only sound cutting through the damp air. Trump's face remained unreadable, his sharp eyes still fixed on John's gaunt, trembling form. John took a deep, shuddering breath, his chest heaving as if the words themselves had drained what little strength he had left. He lowered his head, his graying hair falling over his eyes. "I wasn't always a beggar," he whispered, his voice suddenly small against the backdrop of towering buildings and bustling crowds. "I was a man with a family, with pride, with a purpose. And now I'm just a broken reflection of the country you promised to save." Trump remained silent, his face unreadable, the lines of his jaw set in stone as the reality of John's words hung between them, heavy as the rain-soaked air. John's words lingered in the damp air, hanging like the steam rising from a nearby manhole. The onlookers, now gathered in a small semicircle around the two men, had gone silent, their phones capturing every second of this unexpected confrontation. Trump, known for his quick retorts and unflinching confidence, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. John took a shaky step forward, his knees protesting the sudden movement after hours of sitting on cold concrete. His eyes locked with Trump's, and for the first time in years, he felt the same fire that had once driven him to build his business from the ground up. "You know what the worst part is?" John continued, his voice cracking but unyielding. "It wasn't just my business that you crushed. It was my family, my future. My wife, Linda, she stood by me for 30 years. She watched as I lost contracts, laid off employees, and eventually closed the doors of our small shop for the last time. She watched as I sold my father's old tools just to pay the mortgage. And then she left." Trump's face remained impassive, his blue eyes still fixed on John, but his shoulders had tensed, the slight shift in his stance revealing a hint of discomfort. "She left because I couldn't provide for her anymore," John said, his voice breaking into a whisper. "I became a shell of the man she married, a failure in the eyes of my daughter, a ghost in my own home. She took what little we had left and moved in with her sister in Florida, leaving me to drown in my own shame." John paused, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps, the words dragging up memories he had tried to bury beneath layers of dirt and despair. "I tried to find work, Mr. President," he continued, his tone shifting from sorrow to anger. "I tried. I walked into every garage, every machine shop, every warehouse from Scranton to New York, but nobody wanted a middle-aged, broken-down man with trembling hands and a shattered spirit. They all said the same thing: we're cutting back, we're automating, we're outsourcing, all because of the very policies you pushed." Trump's jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He had heard these complaints before, the bitter tales of those who felt left behind in his economic revolution, but never this raw, never this personal. "And when my savings ran out," John continued, his voice now trembling with a mix of anger and sorrow, "I found myself here, in the gutter, begging for change from people who look at me like I'm trash. Like I'm less than human. I lost my home, my dignity, my purpose, and for what? So the stock market could hit a new high? So billionaires could buy bigger yachts and corporations could stack their bonuses?" Trump opened his mouth to respond, but John pushed on, his words tumbling out in a torrent of pent-up frustration. "I used to have a retirement plan. I used to dream of sitting on my porch, watching the sun set over my backyard, teaching my grandkids how to fix engines, telling them about the American dream. But now I sleep under bridges, I eat from trash cans, and I pray each night that the cold won't claim me before morning. The crowd around them grew, passers-by whispering to each other, their expressions a mix of curiosity, pity, and discomfort. The rain had stopped, but the air remained thick, the atmosphere tense as John's words cut deeper with each syllable. John's voice dropped, his final words barely more than a whisper. You say you're making America great again, but you've turned me into a ghost in my own country. You've taken everything from me, and now you stand here, looking down on me like I'm the one who failed. For the first time, Trump's mask of confidence cracked. His eyes flickered with something, perhaps anger, perhaps discomfort, perhaps even guilt, before the iron mask snapped back into place. Without another word, Trump straightened, his hand gesturing for his agents to step back. He took a step closer to John, his polished shoes nearly touching the frayed edges of John's cardboard seat. He looked down at the broken man before him, his face a blank canvas as he considered his next move. Trump's eyes lingered on John. The two men locked in a silent standoff. Their worlds as far apart as the polished glass towers around them and the cracked concrete beneath John's feet. The crowd, now fully invested in the unfolding drama, leaned in, their breaths held as if they sensed the weight of the moment. Trump took a deep breath, his chest rising beneath his tailored suit, and let it out slowly, his eyes never leaving John's. All right, he said, his voice low but clear, slicing through the murmurs of the crowd. Let's get one thing straight. I didn't ruin your life. I saved this country from the brink of economic disaster. I brought jobs back, cut taxes, and gave businesses a fighting chance. If you failed, that's on you. John's jaw clenched, his fists tightening around the crumpled remains of his cardboard sign. Easy for you to say, he shot back, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. You've never had to worry about missing a mortgage payment, about choosing between feeding your family or keeping the lights on. You've never had to watch everything you built crumble to dust. Trump's eyes flicked to the small crowd forming around them, the glow of smartphone screens capturing every second. He knew this moment could explode across the internet within minutes, and the weight of it settled on his shoulders like a lead vest. You think I've never faced hardship? Trump snapped, his voice rising above the city's hum. I've been through bankruptcies, lawsuits, media smears, you name it. I clawed my way back every time because that's what winners do. They don't give up. They don't sit in the gutter blaming others for their problems. John's face twisted, his eyes narrowing as Trump's words struck a nerve. You really don't get it, do you? He spat, his voice thick with frustration. You were born into wealth. You had $1 million safety net, connections, a family name that opened doors before you even learned to walk. I didn't have that luxury. I built my business with my own two hands, and when your policies crushed it, there was no one to bail me out. Trump's eyes darkened, a muscle in his jaw twitching. He took another step closer, the leather of his shoes nearly brushing the crumbling edges of John's cardboard seat. You talk about hard work, but all I hear are excuses, Trump said, his voice cold. You think you're the only one who's lost something in this world? You think you're the only one who's had to fight to survive. The difference is I didn't give up. The crowd around them murmured, the tension crackling like live wires. John felt his pulse pounding in his temples, his anger simmering dangerously close to the surface. He could feel the weight of his years, the countless sleepless nights, the desperate prayers whispered into the darkness, pressing down on him like a vice. You don't know what it's like to be truly alone, John shot back, his voice trembling but resolute. To lose everything, to watch your family walk away because you're no longer the man you used to be. You talk about winning, but what you've done is left men like me behind, crushed beneath the wheels of your so-called economic miracle. Trump's eyes flicked over John's trembling form, his gaze as sharp as the glass skyscrapers towering above them. For a brief moment, something like understanding flashed across his face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Then stop whining and do something about it, Trump growled, his voice cutting through the cold air like a blade. Get up. Fight. Rebuild. Don't sit here in the gutter blaming me for your failures. John's eyes burned with unshed tears, his heart thundering in his chest as Trump's words struck a nerve he hadn't felt in years. The fire, the drive, the defiance that had once fueled his every waking moment, it flared to life, if only for an instant. Trump straightened, his eyes still locked on John's, his jaw set in a grim line. He turned on his heel, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the wet pavement as he strode back toward his waiting SUV. John watched him go, his chest heaving with the force of his emotions, his hands clenching and unclenching as the crowd slowly began to disperse, their whispers rising into the damp night air. As the black SUV pulled away from the curb, its taillights flashing red against the rain-slicked street, John sank back against the cold brick wall, his head falling into his hands as the tears finally broke free, carving tracks through the dirt on his weathered face. He was alone again, his words echoing in the empty spaces of his mind, the weight of Trump's parting challenge pressing down on him like the weight of the world. The black SUV's taillights disappeared into the foggy distance, leaving John alone once more on the cold, wet sidewalk. The crowd that had gathered slowly dispersed, their whispers fading into the night as the city's pulse resumed its usual rhythm. John slumped against the brick wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps as Trump's final words echoed in his mind. Get up, fight, rebuild. For a long moment, John sat motionless, the cold seeping into his bones, his mind spinning with memories of the life he had lost. He thought of Linda, her warm smile and steady hands, the way she used to hum to herself as she made breakfast in their tiny kitchen. He thought of his daughter, now a grown woman somewhere in Florida, perhaps even raising children of her own grandchildren he had never met. He felt a surge of anger, sharp and bitter, but behind it, something else flickered, a stubborn ember of pride that had refused to die, even in the face of his darkest days. He had been a business owner, a provider, a man who once took pride in his work and his family. Had he truly become nothing more than a broken shell begging for scraps on a street corner? As the cold crept into his fingers, John forced himself to his feet, his joints protesting the sudden movement. He leaned against the wall, his heart pounding in his chest as he took his first shaky steps in months, not just physically but mentally, toward reclaiming the man he once was. Get up, fight, rebuild. The words rang in his mind like the tolling of a bell, each syllable striking a nerve that had long since gone numb. He looked down at the crumpled cardboard sign at his feet, its faded letters a stark reminder of his descent into despair. With a sudden surge of determination, he bent down, his stiff fingers curling around the soggy edges, and tore it in half, the cardboard ripping with a satisfying crack. He straightened, his head held high for the first time in years, his eyes blazing with a newfound resolve. He didn't know where to start or even if he could, but the alternative, this endless cycle of self-pity and despair, was no longer acceptable. John stumbled into a nearby public restroom, his reflection in the cracked mirror a ghostly version of the man he once knew. His beard was wild, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He splashed cold water onto his face, the shock of it snapping his mind into sharper focus. As he dried his hands on his tattered coat, a thought struck him, a memory, faint but clear, of his father's old advice. When life knocks you down, boy, you stand up, dust yourself off, and get back to work. The world doesn't owe you a thing. The words struck him like a bolt of lightning, reigniting a fire he had thought long extinguished. He straightened, rolling his shoulders back, his spine stiffening as he met his own gaze in the dirty mirror. John stepped back onto the bustling street, the city's bright lights reflecting in his newly determined eyes. He walked with purpose, his mind churning with ideas, plans, and fragments of dreams he had once believed were forever out of reach. Over the next few weeks, John hustled like never before. He found a shelter, took a few odd jobs, washing dishes, sweeping floors, even unloading trucks at dawn, anything to put a few dollars in his pocket and rebuild his shattered self-respect. He reconnected with an old friend, a former customer from his auto parts days who had managed to keep his small shop running despite the economic turmoil. John took every dirty, greasy, back-breaking job the man could offer, his hands once again covered in the familiar grime of hard work. Months passed, and slowly, painfully, John began to claw his way back from the brink. His body grew stronger, his mind sharper, his spirit tougher. He saved every penny he could, eventually renting a small room in a rundown apartment building on the edge of town. One rainy afternoon, nearly a year after his confrontation with Trump, John stood outside his friend's shop, his calloused hands resting on his hips as he looked out over the bustling street. He had a roof over his head, a steady job, and, for the first time in a long while, a glimmer of hope for the future. As he watched the crowds pass by, their umbrellas bobbing like tiny, colorful ships on a sea of concrete, John felt a faint smile creep across his face. He had been broken, beaten down, and nearly forgotten, but he had risen, dusted himself off, and fought his way back. He still had a long way to go, but as he turned and walked back into the shop, the smell of oil and grease filling his lungs, he knew one thing for certain: he was no longer a beggar, no longer a ghost, but a man once more. And that, he thought with a grim smile, was worth every ounce of pain he had endured.